Our learning intentions for this lesson is to understand how most flowering plants reproduce and how seeds are formed. We're also going to have a look at the terms pollination and fertilization. A flower almost always has both male and female parts. Do you remember what those parts are called? The carpel, as shown here in this cross-section of a flower, is the female part of the plant. This is often referred to as the pistil as well, but for our purposes we will call it the carpel. The male parts of the flower are called the stamens. So let's look more closely at the stamens. These are the male parts. The top of the stamen is called the anther, and the stalk that it stands on, or the stick that it stands on, is called the filament, and it acts as the same way as the stem, and it holds up the anther. So when you're looking at the anther, you see that it's usually covered in a very yellow sort of material. What do you think that's called? What do you think that powder is called? Okay, we'll come to that in a little bit. The female parts, or the carpel, are made up of three main components: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. We find the stigma at the top of the carpel, and have you ever touched one? What do you remember about when you touched it? You'll find, if you have a flower in the house right now and you touch the stigma, you'd find that it's quite sticky, and there's a reason for that, and again, we'll come back to that as well. The style, this acts the same way as the stem and the filament in the anther, and it holds up the stigma. We find the ovary at the bottom of the style, and this is where the plant's egg is contained. So, what do you think the term pollination might mean? Pollination occurs when the pollen from the anther, or the male part of the plant, is transferred onto the stigma, the female part of the plant. Earlier, I asked you if you knew what pollen was. And pollen is generally yellow, but often comes in some other colors. But this is the male DNA. So from the male part of the plant, this is the one half of the DNA required to make a new plant. This pollen then finds a way to be transferred onto the stigma of the female part of the plant. Now again, as we mentioned before, the stigma is quite sticky. So when the pollen lands, or when the pollen arrives, it sticks to the stigma. In order to reproduce or make a new plant, many flowering plants need to be pollinated. This means that the pollen from the male part of the plant needs to reach the stigma, or the female part of the plant. And while some plants can be pollinated by the male and female parts of that same flower or plant, many plants cannot. The pollen must land on another plant of the same species or type. This is called cross-pollination. So here we have a cross-section of that same flower, and you can see the pollen is on the anther of this flower. That pollen must then move from the anther to the stigma. And what do you remember about the stigma of a flower? That's right, it's sticky. Now here's an opportunity for us to put our thinking caps on. What do you think are some of the ways in which pollen might be moved from the anther to the stigma, from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant? Now I'd like you to pause the video right now and just spend some time thinking about that, and then we'll come back to it. If you said insects, well, you're absolutely correct. Insects are one of the ways in which pollen gets from the anther to the stigma. And of course, as you know, they're one of my favorite things, so I do love insects. Here we see a bee, and it's milling about the top of the flower. And as it's doing so, the pollen is sticking to the bee, and then the bee is then moving it or carrying it over to the stigma from this flower or perhaps to another flower. So, how's a flower supposed to make sure that an insect is going to land on it? How's it going to attract them? Well, many flowers are scented, and they give off this sweet smell which entices the insect to come to the flower. Some give off a really rotten, stinky smell, and it also attracts a different kind of insect. Can you think of what that might be? Some provide nectar, which is a sweet, sugary liquid which gives food to the insects as they're flying around. And a third way in which they can do it is with attractive petals. And they do this to attract the insects by tricking them generally into thinking that it's a female of their species. Anyone with hay fever knows there is definitely another way for pollen to get around, and that's on the wind. Pollen is very light, and as the wind blows, it gets picked up and carried, and if it's fortunate enough, it'll land on the right flower, and pollination has occurred. That pollen, either brought by an insect, carried by the wind, or some other form of transfer, has now landed on the stigma. What happens next? Well, just below the stigma is something called the style, and that style, it's a hollow tube of sorts. And the pollen then it creates its own little tube, and it travels down the style into the ovary. Now, inside the ovary, that's where the eggs are contained. And so the DNA from the pollen mixes with the DNA from the egg, and together they produce a zygote or a new seed. Here we have a cross-section of that same flower, and you can see the pollen is on the anther. It gets transported over to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower, and then the pollen then travels down the style into the ovary, where it mixes with the eggs, and then a seed is formed. So, pollen, which we know is from the male part of the plant, when it mixes with the egg, which we know is from the female part of the plant, a seed is produced. This process is called fertilization. So now comes the fun part of this presentation, your task. What we want you to do is we want you to draw the diagram that comes in the next slide in your jotter. We want you to label the important parts in the processes of pollination and fertilization, and then in some simple sentences we want you to explain what is happening in each of these 5 stages. Okay, the diagram is numbered, and then once you've finished all that, we'd like you to upload a picture of your work to your Google Classroom. All right.